if you would just kind of sign in, put your name, your email on there, just so we can kind of keep a record of who's here, how many showed up. If you come back tomorrow, you can just put another mark by your name. You don't have to redo your name. You just so we'll just kind of an idea. So if you would do that before you leave and do it in the morning when you get here, would greatly appreciate that. So, Lonnie, we'll let you come back in. Just eat the cookie. You can have your drink, but eat the cookie. There you go. No cookies in here. Catherine worked really hard vacuuming in here today. And if you do spill something, please let us know so we can get it cleaned up. Don't just leave it, okay? All right? So, brother, we're going to...
Okay. I'll try not to spill anything. No, I got some. Thank you. I'll probably be all right. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're going to pick back up here, and I got to be honest, I don't have these slides exactly gauged, and somebody's already mentioned too that the font size on that is probably okay, but the smaller ones are hard to see. I apologize for that. We may be able to change all that. I just don't know how that'll make them flow, because the problem is I've already got them out spaced in this notebook with extra stuff, so I'm not sure if I can fix this without breaking this. So you may just have to use the paper one. But anyway, hopefully between the two you'll be able to use that, and it'll be something helpful. So this is part we were talking about, learning to tell your story, and why it is important to tell your story. And so this is what I mean by that. I just told you a minute ago a part of our story, Lynn's and mine. And if you have a situation even similar to this at all, or you know, or you people you work with, maybe you're in a situation like that, you can tell your story as you relate with them, as you are engaged with them in ministry and work and whatever that is. And that is your story. It's either what you are firsthand going through with a loved one, a spouse, a family member, a friend, or even maybe you're a little more, maybe it's a client or a colleague. Either way, your story is what's going on with you as you try to live with that person in an understanding and a helpful way. That's what the Bible tells husbands to do with their wives, live with your wife in an understanding way. Well, in one sense, I think we could say that applies to all of us as Christians, live with one another in an understanding way. And definitely that's what we're trying to learn to do in this conference. So why really is that important for you to tell your story? Someone came up at the break and told me about their story. It's pretty complicated. It's pretty difficult, and this person was at least glad to know that someone is thinking about these things, and someone is talking about it, because this person said it even puts words to my story, that you, me, speaker, speaking, doing this, are putting some words to my story. Sometimes that's exactly what we need. Sometimes that's exactly where we are, is you don't even know. If I said, journal for me this week and tell me next week about your story, you may not even feel like you know where to begin. You may not even know how to put it into words, because you might not even be sure that you know how even to think about it, or even how you really feel about it. I mean, these are not light and trivial matters at all, even though there's hope. So others cannot support you unless they know something about what's going on. And this is where it gets a little bit difficult, because we're used to being really private, and we don't air the dirty laundry or whatever. You don't hang it out on the clothesline. You dry it in the dryer in the house, whatever those sayings are. Well, this is a chance to kind of get over that and move beyond that and move forward and be willing to become vulnerable. And that's what it entails. You will, to some degree, increase your vulnerability if you tell your story. But that's okay. The Lord wants you to be able to tell your story. And you learn a lot about yourself by telling your story. I know for me, when I would say what I told you a minute ago, I would tell people a little bit of our story, and I would pause and I would say, but that's not what I signed up for. And you can even tell by the tone of my voice in saying that I'm a little bit ticked sounding. And I was. Hopefully right now I'm not so much. But I'll just be vulnerable and honest in telling you my story. I was really angry. I was doing some computer programming, so I knew how to get code from Google and write a program called a packet sniffer. A packet sniffer that takes the data that goes in and out of your house through your internet connection, and I could read the I am messages that my son was doing from his computer. So I became Dad, the sin police, Dad, the family cop, and I was more than ticked off when I found what he was already into at 14 years of age. That didn't help his situation in the least. But I learned about myself, and the Lord taught me. But as you tell your story, listen to how you tell it. Listen to the tone of your voice when you share that story. And you will learn a lot about yourself. Do you feel flushed? Does your face get hot and red? That tells you something, is that you're learning about yourself. You're learning about how you're responding to this as you tell your story. Do you use strong language? I love it when I read Paul Tripp, because he always makes these really brash and harsh statements. Jesus says these things that are just super hyperbole. I love that kind of stuff. But Jesus is Jesus. He can use that in a sinless way. David is not, and David oftentimes would use those harsh words because David was foolish enough to think that by the power of his verbalization he could stop son from sinful track, and it didn't work, and it doesn't work. But it told me eventually something about myself that I needed to learn, that I was basically frustrated and mad that I was having to deal with this at all because I didn't sign up for that. I'm his dad. I pay for everything he has. I'm providing a place for him. I'm teaching him the Word of God. I take him to church. I teach his Sunday school class. We have devotions in our home. We worship God, sometimes with guitar and music, the whole deal. And this is what I get out of this. That's not what I signed up for. But you can see in that where the Lord wanted to work was also in me and my heart. But if I were not willing to be open and honest about that, I wouldn't tell my story accurately and honestly to begin with. I would never have even seen that. Here's a helpful exercise. Listen to how you tell your story, either when you speak it to someone else or if you wrote it out. And if you have the time, which you might not, between this evening and tomorrow or sometime over the weekend, just go through that exercise. Remember how you told the last friend when you were telling about what your husband was up to, or what your daughter was doing, or your granddaughter. Think about that and listen to the way you told that story. Think about how you would write it down if you wrote it. It's a really helpful exercise to help you kind of connect in your own heart with what's really going on there. What's up with the harsh words? What's up with the red face and the frustration? What does the Lord want to do about that? And so we need to be able to be willing to tell our story honestly and transparently. I can't really overemphasize that, I don't think. It's sad to see how little honest and transparent sharing goes on goes on among Christians. That should not be that way. This is the one place among the people of God we ought to be safe, and we ought to be able to be transparent, to be honest about our struggle. I'm not proud of what I just told you about my own struggle, about my own situation, but I trust that you will hear that with a sympathetic ear and an empathizing heart, and you will say, wow, I need to pray for David. He's got a lot going on. And that ought to be the trust factor that should be built in our churches, that ought to just be the normal place to go. Unfortunately, there's a man of a big church in Atlanta that was like head of the counseling and things that they did in their church. And he told me a couple of years ago, he said, the church is not a safe place for people to talk about these problems or issues. And I'm saying, I didn't tell him this, but I'm thinking in my mind, to me, that's not acceptable. That's no excuse. We as people of God can learn to love wisely and love well, and we can have, as our body, as members of one another, we can have a safe and create a safe environment, not only for us, but from people who would come from outside. We were talking earlier about, during the break or at the end of the session, about being prepared more for how to help people in these kinds of situations. One thing that's going on in other churches that we work with, Lynn and I, is that they're offering counseling help to the community. And so in that way, it becomes an invitation of Christ to the surrounding community. Basically, it's another form of outreach. In one sense, what we do in our ministry is evangelism and discipleship through counseling. That's one way to think about what we do, and it's true. We do have different training, we do have background and experience, but still, at the end of the day, that's really the hope we have for the people that we try to serve, is the hope of the gospel. So telling your story, though, honestly and transparently, is really an important part of all of this, and learning to be a place where people do feel safe. Our knee-jerk response most of the time is to just hide these things. And see, that goes right back to the Garden of Eden. What if, when Lynn and I found our son in that trouble, we just tried to cover it up? In my mind, what we would have been doing is exactly what Adam and Eve did. Eve took from that one tree, ate that fruit, and gave it to Adam, and he also ate. They heard the sound of God coming in the garden, and they went and they hid themselves from him. That is what we tend to do with these kinds of problems. Alcohol addiction, drug addiction, mental health disorders. There's a stigma that goes with those. Kind of like, you remember the people that would have to live outside the city, and if you came out to the outside of the city, they had to say, unclean, unclean. That's pretty much what it feels like sometimes to be in a church and have a son addicted to drugs and self-medicating because his anxiety is basically rendering him almost unfunctional. It's unclean, and it ought not to be that way. If you don't know somebody in any of these kind of situations, if none of this sounds remotely familiar to you, this will sound familiar, is that we need to be the people of God where people can feel safe coming in and confiding in us, that we won't go talk badly about them, that we won't feel badly toward them, but that they are safe with what they tell us, that we will take it to heart. We may not know the answers, but we can pray. And that really is far more powerful than all of my answers. I can't give you anything that even comes close to touching the power of God through prayer. So all of us can do that. And that's what we ought to aim at being. That's when we will start to see people sharing their stories in a more honest and open way. The shame and the guilt can just lead us to try to cover up those issues, and that's not going to help anyone.